Welcome to all of you who've braved the wind and the rain this morning. We'd particularly like to welcome our guests who are with us this weekend or perhaps longer at the Expanding Light, and those of you who may be visiting from other parts of Northern California. It's a joy to have you with us this morning. For those of you who don't know us, I'm Catherine Van Houten, and this is my husband, Peter. And it's our delight to share Sunday service with you. Our topic this morning is, by thinking, can we arrive at understanding? And these are commentaries based on parallel passages from the Bible and the Bhagavad Gita by Swami Kriyananda. Truth is one and eternal. Realize oneness with it in your deathless self within. The following commentary is based on the teachings of Paramahansa Yogananda. There are many places in the Gospels where we see Jesus in open conflict with the Pharisees, that is to say, with man-made as opposed to true mystical tradition. In the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 15, we see a good example of how they and he locked horns. Then some of the scribes and Pharisees from Jerusalem came and asked Jesus, "Why do your disciples break our ancient tradition and eat their food without washing their hands properly first?" Jesus, after scolding them for their hypocrisy in observing lesser rules so carefully while ignoring the much more important ones, said, "Listen and understand this thoroughly. It is not what goes into a man's mouth that makes him common or unclean. It is what comes out of a man's mouth that makes him unclean." It wasn't that Jesus counseled against such wholesome practices as washing one's hands before eating. In an age, however, when lesser rules were given too much importance relative to the truly important observances, cleansing the heart of impure desires, for example, he emphasized the supreme importance of loving God and of communing with him. The Pharisees, the orthodox religionists of his day, in other words, had brought true religion down to a level of intellectual hair-splitting. They mistakenly considered the way to understanding to lie through a minefield of definitions, which they tried to refine to ultimate exactitude. Jesus taught, however, that the intellect alone can never lead one to truth. Without love, indeed, there is no ultimate verity. Without fixity of purpose, born of the heart's devotion, the intellect wanders endlessly. It cannot settle for long on anything. As the Bhagavad Gita says in the 2nd chapter, the intellects of those who lack fixity of spiritual purpose are inconstant, their interests endlessly ramified. Thus, through Holy Scripture, God has spoken to mankind. Om, Om, Om.
This is from Paramahansa Yogananda's book of Mystical Poems, Whispers from Eternity, as edited by Swami Kriyananda. This is the prayer demand for removing the cork of ignorance. Nor more shall my consciousness remain bottled in this little vessel of flesh corked with ignorance. No more will I remain
moving through the sea of consciousness night and day, for years, decades, how many incarnations, so close yet never able to contact thee. Through the bursting vibration of the cosmic sound and the surging of thy holy name, I have removed the cork of ignorance which so long separated me from thee, though we lived so closely together for incarnations. Now my body consciousness will meet thy all-surrounding, all-pervading consciousness. No longer will I walk heedlessly in thee, but never knowing and feeling thee. Thine image within me shall meet thine image everywhere. By releasing the I-ness in me, I will know that I am thou, and that thou art the little egos of us all. I was thinking this week about the nature of spiritual experience. I think for all of us as devotees, we often wonder why our own path to God really. Could someone help that child? I'm sorry, I don't know if I can give a talk with a child screaming there. My apologies. It's interesting in talking to devotees from all points in their spiritual journey, people who've been veteran meditators for many years to people that are sort of here for their first day on the spiritual path. And people's experience of the spiritual path is just all over the map. Some of the people that I value the most, that I seek out counsel of when I'm in distress, will tell me, I don't feel like I have chakras. I don't really feel anything when I meditate. And yet when I think of how should I behave in a certain situation, I look at what they would do, and that's the right thing. When I'm having trouble, that's the person I want to talk to. So whether they're feeling anything or not, they're showing the manifestation of God realization. They're showing the manifestation of their meditation, but they may not feel it. And other people who may be brand new and are going to be here for a day and moving on to something else that seems more interesting may have a profound experience of their astral nervous system, some aspect of God. They'll hear Om loudly, they'll feel their heart open, and yet tomorrow they're gone. And they're off to something else that seems more interesting. Master actually talked about giving a talk in an auditorium and realizing that there was a woman in the audience who was having a profound spiritual experience, extremely deep, where every aspect of her spiritual nature opened. And, for any of us as devotees, you'd think of that and just, my God, what an incredible thing to have. And then he followed it by saying, and she walked away and never came back. Have something that intimate, that profound, and yet walk away from it. I think there's a lesson in here for all of us. It's very hard for us to know in our lifetimes why our spiritual journey looks and feels the way it does. And the most unhelpful thing we can do is compare ourselves to anyone else, to listen to what other people are dealing with or feeling, because we'll end up getting confused about our own journey. I remember when I first came here, this many years ago, over 30 years ago now, that when I'd first come here to live, and this was kind of I'd been wanting to be a devotee for at least 5 years and had been meditating regularly. But this was the point where I'd really said, I don't want anything else. I'm willing to give up everything else in my life to seek God. And I know I belong here. And it was very interesting to me because my understanding at that point was that God realization came through meditation. And I remember having this thought when I entered here and because this is a community of tremendous outward service. There's always a ton to do. There's tremendous demands. It's a good thing. It's a helpful thing spiritually to serve. But at that time I thought, oh, well, this makes a lot of sense. There's the people who can meditate, and for the people who can't meditate, well, they can serve. I feel such an idiot not having gotten that. But that's exactly what I thought. It's a little bit like those that can't do teach. But you know, I had a very interesting experience with this because I remember I knew people who had really focused their lives just on meditating. So they were meditating 4 to 6 hours a day, not serving anyone, just sort of more secluded, and just doing that very concertedly. And I knew others that basically were right in the middle of the kind of rough and tumble world of daily life in our spiritual community. And after about 6 months, I began to notice something. One, I noticed the person who was meditating sort of very intensively and sort of was, I'm doing my meditation, that they looked more egotistical. They looked like they were getting powerful, but it was creepy. It was. And I also realized when I looked at the people who were serving with wild abandon and meditating, tucking their meditation around as they could, but never thinking about themselves and just serving, is I realized I wanted to be like them. They had a purity of heart that was so magnetic. And it finally dawned on me that, you know, there probably are people that are at a point in their spiritual development where retiring to the Himalayas and meditating deeply is really the point they're at, and that may be good. But probably for the vast majority of us, we're going to be just the same situation Swami Kriyananda's in, where we're serving like mad and then tucking in our meditation around the edges. That seems to be what God has called, has asked of us, and we've been drawn to a work where that really is the way it seems to be for everyone. What I realized about this is that it's really the nature of spiritual experience, and why this idea of, well, I can feel my chakras or I can't, or I can feel my heart or I can't, or I can see the spiritual eyes or I can't, really does not matter. Because when we become disciples and we've made that decision of, I will live my life for God, God takes us very seriously. We have the masters, we have God himself that is guiding our every thought, our every action, our every experience. I actually had this thought this morning. If we could look at our lives the way the masters see them, we're probably like a little 2-year-old toddler that has just learned to walk, and there's the grandparents sort of hovering around them, trying to, be the blockers and grab the child before he runs into traffic. And the child wants to go pet the nice little kitty, which is actually this giant Doberman Pinscher that's ready to bite him. But the child doesn't know, and is just sort of toddling around and running around, and yet there's this loving blockade around him to sort of make everything okay. And our lives are that way. Don't think for an instant that there's anyone in this room that doesn't have some horrific karma that we are going to have to get through. And yet the beauty is that we have the masters blocking for us, blending that out of the way, protecting us while we have to go through that. Our understanding of the central nervous system even shows that at the level of our brain, our central nervous system, that there's this constant refinement process that goes on, and that on every level we're being changed and refined. And I remember I had this experience. This is actually a very odd thing, but I think it's very illustrative of what I was thinking of. This was about, 12, 15 years ago, and we were up in Seattle to give some classes at the center there, and Hriman and Padma are the center leaders there. Hriman had just had this great joke that he'd heard, and he was sort of telling everybody this joke. And the thing that was great about it is just, he's this very transparent kind of guy. And you knew he was going to tell you this joke, and you sort of had to sit there and let the joke come. But the best part was watching him tell the joke. It's much better than the joke itself, because he could barely get the punchline out without sort of dissolving into this laughter. And this was the joke. So a man is out walking his dog, a little Chihuahua, one day, and he walks the dog past a pub, and he sees some of his friends in the pub, and they're watching a football game on the monitor, and he decides, I'd really like to go in there, but what about my dog? There's a big sign, no dogs allowed. And so he's thinking, well, I can't leave my dog out here. Somebody's going to come give it an espresso and make it even more nervous. And then he notices that a blind man comes by, and he has a service dog with him. And walks right into the pub, and no one thinks anything about it. So he gets this idea, well, I'll just pretend I'm blind and I'll go in with my chihuahua. So he puts his sunglasses on and does his best imitation of a blind, staggering person and walks through the door of the pub. And immediately the pub's owner said, "Wait a minute, no dogs in here." And the man said, "No, no, no, I'm blind. This is my guide dog." And the pub's owner says, "Come on, guy, that's a chihuahua." And he goes, "Oh, they gave me a chihuahua?" Now this is the joke. You know how it is sometimes when you're with people for several days. You'll sort of develop a little sort of in thing about. We sort of use that punchline whenever we would mock surprise. We would do the "Oh, they gave me a chihuahua," a sort of mock surprise. And Fremont and I were out on some errand, and something had happened, and we were just sort of laughing over this whole thing of, "Oh, they gave us a chihuahua." And we opened the door to the alleyway behind the shop that we were in to go out and get in our car. And we were just laughing about this thing that, "Oh, they gave me a chihuahua." And I stuck my head out the door, and there was this elderly, blind Latino man with a little red, with a white cane with a red tip on it, and he was walking a chihuahua. And we were both so shocked that we got in the car, and I actually said to Freeman, I said, "Did that just happen?" I mean, if we had turned around and they had vanished, I would not be at all surprised. And it's very funny how God works with us, and sometimes in very almost whimsical ways teaches us a lesson. And the lesson that I have felt from that for years is, remember, I know your every thought, I know your every action, and even when everything seems wonderful and you're feeling light and happy, I'm still there with you. It's not just when you're in the middle of an automobile accident or a crisis in your life, that's the point I come. I'm there with you all the time. And I know your every thought. I know your every action. I know everything about you. And I'm there with you, protecting you. It's always been a very moving thought for me, and yet it was such a almost whimsical experience. It's a curious thing for me. I've been going through kind of an odd period in my life over the last 3 years. I work as a family doctor, have for almost the last 30 years. We have a medical clinic that we started nearby almost 30 years ago. It's hard to believe that many years have gone by, and many of the people in the room right now have worked there with us as part of our team over the years. And certainly you try to do a very serviceable thing where finances are always a bit of a question, and rules and regulations are always changing, and the legal environment is very rough, and you're taking care of a poor population. In our world, it's like 60% of our patients would be considered impoverished. And we've developed a bit of a real skill in dealing with people who are mentally ill, and so we have a substantial number of what would be called seriously mentally ill patients in our practice. It's a great service. All of us who serve there can really feel that no matter how awful it may feel in the moment getting through a day, at the end of the day that we've really changed people's lives. And there are people that will be doing better because we hung in there with them during that day and served them when maybe we didn't feel like serving. That we tried to feel for God's presence in a situation, and in some subtle way that has influenced how they will do. And maybe they don't even know why they feel so good when they come to see us. It's an odd thing. I remember one fellow who I would see intermittently about every 2 or 3 years, and this was over this whole 27-year period. I don't even know if he's alive now. He had to come a very long way to see us, and he had a doctor near where he lived, and so a lot of times we wouldn't see him for a year or two at a time. And I remember the last time I saw him, I'd probably see him, I don't know, 20 times over the last 30 years, about once a year. We were dealing with some health issue he was having, and I was sort of dutifully writing out a prescription for him and sort of explaining how to take his medication and what to expect from it, and that I thought he'd do very well. And he was like a little kid who had a salamander he wanted to show me. It was like he had this. He finally said, "I have to tell you something. All these years I've come here, and every time I come here, you listen to me and you make a diagnosis, and you are probably exactly right as to what is wrong. And if I need a prescription, you'll write one or you'll tell me what to do." But the truth is, I'd go home and I'd feel so much better. I'll go to the pharmacy tomorrow. I'm actually feeling a little better today. I've had enough for today. It's a long drive getting out there. And then I'd realize 2 or 3 days had gone by and I'd never filled the prescription. And invariably, I'd end up tearing up the prescription and throwing it away. And I never had the heart to tell you that, because I was worried. I was worried you might be mad at me. And I said, "Of course not. I mean, in the end, I just wanted you to be better." So however that happened. And he said, "I know you're a devotee, and I know that's probably why I feel better when I leave, is that you're not doing this for any other reason than for my own higher self." And I know that. I just wanted you to know that I never took all that medication you gave me. It was good. It's good. Sometimes it's good to have experiences like that. It's a little humbling when we think we're making such a big impact in the world with technical mental things we do. And in fact, it's always love. That's what people need from us, is our love. And someone comes to you for, I find this in my medical practice, that I feel like the best times I've been where I've really helped people is when I just shut up. And my tendency is to want to give advice and sort of help people understand. And I remember a few months ago, this fellow came in, a fellow I'd seen for his health for probably 20 years, and only see him once or twice a year. Very healthy man, and he was now in his 70s. And his wife had just died. And I didn't know that. And I walked in the room and I sat down, and I knew something was profoundly wrong. I didn't have to look at his chart. I could just tell. I mean, this was a man who was devastated. And it was, I just said, "What's wrong?" And he, all sort of tumbled out. And as guys often will, it's like they're trying to keep a control on their feelings and they can't, and it just pours out. And I remember thinking at the time that, keep your mouth shut. This guy's lost his dearest friend. He clearly doesn't have a relationship with anyone else in this world. And what are you going to say to that? "My condolences. Sorry for your loss." And so I just sat there and let him talk. And my poor staff, they were probably wondering what happened to me. But it was probably the most important thing I was going to do that whole week, was just sit there. And I remember thinking at the end, he kind of talked all this stuff out. And I remember thinking at the end, I just said, "Thank you for sharing that with me. And let me know if there's any way I can be of help." And I refilled his prescriptions, and he kind of went on his way. And I was just thinking, how marvelous God can help people if we're just there and just with them. I don't think I would have said anything that would have been helpful. I mean, this poor man's heart had been torn out. There's nothing I could have done for that. And yet, if I'm there as a devotee and care about him as much as I can as a channel for God's love, that is healing. And I'm sure he felt that. He was much better and much calmer when he left. And I certainly don't think it had anything to do with me as a human being. Anyway, over the last 3 years, we've been through a rather curious time at the clinic. It's just been harder than usual. And I don't know, I'm very much one to say, for anybody who's on the spiritual path, things are really hard and really tough. What'd you expect? I mean, if you say, I want God realization, you better expect God's going to take you up on it, because we all have we have desires, we have past karma, we have a lot of things that we need help through. And once we make that commitment that we want God realization, God takes us at our word and begins to march us through that. But remember, it's like the toddler walking into traffic, that there's all this blocking happening all around. We don't see it. We don't see the protection that's happening about us. I just can't help but think at the end of our lives where we can see the overview of our lives and realize how many things we've been saved from. You know, I was thinking about this morning that just before I got on the spiritual path, there were two things that happened in my life that I was sort of headed down a whole different pathway with my life, either professional or interpersonal. And it was right at the point I was going to commit to being on a different pathway with my life. Would have taken me far away from here, I think. I don't think I would be here right now if I chose either of those things. That it was almost like, you know, the magician who pulls the napkin out from underneath the glasses on the table. It's just poof, you know, there was this change, and whatever it was that I thought was going to happen didn't happen. And it was like, I don't understand this. How could I be that unlucky to be at this point where my whole life is headed in this direction and it just vanishes? It just didn't seem possible. I remember talking to my friends at the time, and you know, they didn't know what to tell me. It was like, well, you're either incredibly unlucky or maybe you're incredibly lucky and you got saved from something that was not going to be good for you in the long term. And I can say that from my perspective now, I was very lucky. I just didn't realize I was the toddler walking into traffic. And got snatched at the last second. And as confusing as it felt at that time, I was snatched. Anyway, over our last 3 years at the clinic, it just seemed that bit by bit, things were getting taken away from us. You know, our finances went from being sort of tight but workable to really unsupportable. We just weren't able to make the clinic work financially, and bit by bit, key staff members were getting pulled away to do other things, and we couldn't really afford to replace them. And we were having difficulty with, you know, integrating with other organizations. It just seemed like there were all these things. Nothing was really working quite right. And I remember thinking, you know, I'd have a rhythm in my week, you know, where I'd serve patients during the week. And on the weekends, I'd get to meditate a little bit more. I'd go work in the forest. I'd do things that were really rejuvenating for me, maybe be a little social. But there was this drive more, you know, always to grab more. And so I'd sort of hit the end of the week and I'd realize I either had so much extra work that I had to do that weekend, or I was so worn out that all the things that I would normally want to go do to sort of replenish myself and to feel more like a human being and not just, you know, a doc in the box, I either didn't have time to do them or didn't have the energy to do them. And this went on for about 1.5 years, and I thought, this can't get any worse. And it's like my friend in the emergency room when I was an intern used to say to me, remember, Peter, it can always be worse. It's 2 a.m. and the 3 gunshot wound victims have just been brought in, and you just find out there's a major accident on the freeway. And he would whisper in my ear, remember, Peter, it can always get worse. And I remember thinking that at this point, that as awful as this felt, you know, it could always get worse, and it did. More people got taken away. We went from having 4 medical providers to see patients. You know, we'd see about 15,000 patient visits a year. That's a lot of patient visits. Remember, a lot of these are critically ill people that, you know, are mentally ill. They don't have any other place to go. People would just sort of do King's X when they'd see them. You know, they'd just get away. You know, we don't want you. And yet they were who we took care of. And they were depending on us to make good decisions for their health care and to care about them. And one by one, our providers started getting pulled away. I mean, we were fortunate. We had people like David Kessler. We were able to call in and do more for us. He's always been very kind over the years to help us when we've needed more help. But it was just, even with that, more was getting taken away. And I remember at one point there was about a 1.5-month period where I was the one main provider, main medical person left, and normally we'd have 4, and yet we had almost the same number of patients to see. And I thought, I'm either going to die or go crazy, and I'm not sure which one I want at this point. And, you know, I think, like many things in life, when we get put in a situation where we feel like we're being stretched far beyond the bounds of our abilities, I mean, I knew enough about medicine. It wasn't like being an intern where I felt like my constant prayer all day was, please don't let me make a mistake. I mean, I lived a year as my first year of really practicing medicine doing that. A very appropriate prayer for an intern, by the way. Well, I already had a lot under my belt as a medical practitioner, so that wasn't the hard part. It was, can I stay feeling? Can I stay kind? Can I not get terminally angry at my staff? You know, I mean, I'm kind of person, I don't really think of myself as an angry person, but I found out I had quite a temper and I was a real grouch sometimes. And it was so unusual for me to feel that. It was very disquieting. And I remember I noticed that I'd sort of gone for like 5 nights in a row where I'd come home and I'd feel so sort of in this suspended animation state that I would just reach for a box of breakfast cereal because that's what I had for breakfast. And that seemed like the most complicated thing I could do was pour some cereal into a bowl. And the decision of adding almonds or fruit to it was kind of beyond my capacity. And then I'd put it in front of me and it was like I was too tired to eat. Or I'd lay down and I'd lay there and it'd be almost like this suspended animation state where I wasn't asleep, I wasn't awake, but I couldn't do anything. When I'd sleep, it felt like being in a coma. Is so bizarre. It's a very surreal period, and it just went on and on. And every time I think, well, maybe we're right near the end of this, something else would not be working, and it would just push the resolution of some of these things off into the future. And I finally realized at some point that, yep, this is all going to work itself out. Maybe 3 to 4 months more. It's actually going to be pretty good. Well, of course, I was off by about 100%. So it was really more like 6 to 8 months. But the happy news was at that point, we could at least see there was light at the end of the tunnel and it was not a train. Okay, so I sort of tumbled through this and sort of staggered out the other end, and things are going great. And I actually had a Saturday when I sat down at my desk, 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock in the morning, and I looked at everything on my desk. I realized I didn't have anything that I had to do that day. I always had felt that for over a year. Anytime I sat at my desk, there was always at least one important thing I was not doing if I wasn't busy right at that second. And I just realized I couldn't remember the last time I had felt that. It had been that long. And I was finally able to meditate with something more than just sort of a perfunctory, okay, I'm going to do my kriyas, and I'm not even sure I did them, but there's my beads. I guess I'm done. I got to go to work. And after 3 years of that, I was actually pretty happy to feel like, well, I'm meditating with a little depth again. This is where it got very strange. I began thinking again, and I began sort of looking at myself and thinking, okay, well, it's been 3 years and you haven't really thought about what you're doing. And are you still God's devotee? Are you still doing everything because you want God realization? Or has your mind begun to creep out and want different things? Or are you off track in other areas? And I began actually getting kind of depressed about it. And this went on for several days, and it just kept getting worse. I mean, the more I would think, the worse it felt. And this is such a strange thing to say, but I felt at one point like someone had walked up in front of me and pulled a flaming javelin out and just impaled my heart. And I don't know where that came from, but clearly there was some inharmony in me where that happened, and it was so painful. It was disquieting. I felt confused by it. Initially I wondered, am I having a heart attack? I thought maybe I'm going crazy. I deal a lot with mentally ill people. Maybe I caught some. Or maybe I'm just a late blooming psychotic. It's... But as uncomfortable as this was, I could feel underneath it that I was protected. Whatever this was not something I had to be afraid of. It was incredibly disquieting, and I'd have to tell you that I went for weeks where I felt like I really should warn people when I'm around them, because it was like I'd been given truth serum. I didn't know what I was going to actually say, because it was... I couldn't just hide behind my roles anymore. The role of who I was, it's often when we're going through a hard time, sometimes it's nice we have very specific roles we do because it allows us to sort of keep functioning when we're much too tired to sort of keep everything up. But I didn't have to be in a role anymore, and I had to sort of deal precisely with who I was at a heart level. And there were definitely things that I didn't know what to make of. And I was, and the thing that was so strange about it is it felt confusing. And I'd have to say temperamentally, I'm the kind of person that I usually don't feel confused by life. I sort of know I've made my choices. This is what I'm doing. This is where I'm going. And this may be unpleasant right now. This may not feel nice, but there's a reason for it. And I may complain, but I know I'm going to get through it and I know where I'm going. And this had such an element of confusion to it. I felt when I was around other people that it was like somehow the covering, the peel around my heart had just been ripped off. And I could feel other people in a way that was very disquieting. I mean, I usually feel people's energy. I work with people all the time. I'm sort of always kind of checking and feeling, how's this person doing? How's my staff doing? But it was like being in a room full of radios, and instead of having them at a quiet level and all tuned to a different station, even the pleasant radios had been turned way up. So even the pleasant people that normally I'd feel very comfortable with, it was almost overwhelming just being around other people. And yet I didn't feel like staying at home was a good idea. So I'd go to work and take care of people all day. And it actually felt stabilizing in its own way. The thing that struck me with this, it made me appreciate, number one, living in a spiritual community and why spiritual communities are so helpful, why it's helpful as a devotee going through a process of God realization, why having other people around of wisdom who can advise you when things happen that are outside your experience and can help guide you, why that's so important. For me, it was very helpful to have others where I could say, this is what I'm feeling, this is what I'm experiencing, and have them really listen to it. And the feedback I would get was always a little different, but in fact, it was the same. And I always would feel this underlying reassurance of, this is really okay. You just have to live through this. This is part and parcel of spiritual growth, and this can happen, and don't make a big deal out of it. Just, keep growing through this. This will morph into its next step. And I also noticed that gradually the experience that I was feeling inwardly was changing. It was the energy that I'd felt initially in my heart that was, it's so funny. We use this term in medicine when something is incredibly painful. When someone has a kidney stone, for example, we say it's an exquisite pain, to mean that it's the worst pain you could imagine. It's an 11 out of 10 on a scale of 10 type pain. And I always thought that was kind of kind of an oxymoron. It was sort of like a freezer burn, one of these things where it didn't really quite make sense that if something's really painful, it's a crushing pain but this in its own way was exquisitely painful because it was as though God's hand was in this helping me somehow. And I could also feel that somehow this was the tip of a much larger karma that I was just feeling the periphery of, being just far away enough from a fire that you realize that fire is really hot and it's a little uncomfortable to be even here, but I'm not going to get burned. But I am going to really feel the heat from it. And I realized that during, this several week period where this was feeling so intense, I was praying like a desperate person. I felt like I was drowning. I was a drowning man praying for air. That's the way I was praying to God, to help me understand this, guide my actions and guide my thoughts so that I do the right things. I understand this. I didn't understand this. What I realized was that, in fact, the drowning time, I just finished it. And it was a little bit like when you have you sit in an odd position and your leg goes to sleep and you first go and get up and all of a sudden you realize your leg doesn't work and it starts aching and you sort of walk around limping. That in some ways it was kind of like that the real crisis had been, in fact, before. And all God could do was kind of put me to sleep and let me almost go through it like a sleepwalker, not really feeling the full force of my karma, because it would have been too awful on some level. And yet, at this point, I could sort of see what had happened and realize what a narrow escape I'd had with everything that I'd been going through and how much God, in fact, had carried me. When I felt like I was kind of trudging on alone, that in fact, God was carrying me through this process. And in fact, like the little child getting protected from running into traffic, was constantly blocking things out of the way. And it's just, again, I look at that 3-year period, and it's like many things when I look back at our existence as a clinic, is that I can't believe we got through all this. I mean, it does, it's just like the blind man walking the Chihuahua in the hallway, in the alleyway, when we were talking about a blind man walking a Chihuahua and laughing about it, and poof, there it is. It's like all my logical reasoning says this should not have worked. And yet here we are, a vibrant clinic, and still doing lots of good and gotten through these tremendous travails. And I wonder how much karma got burned up in all that we didn't even know about, and how much we were protected from. I think what the place I'd like to end with this is, again, to go back to this concept of spiritual experiences. And I think the spiritual experiences we have, really our spiritual experiences is our life. And if you're someone who feels like, I can't feel my chakras, or I can't see the spiritual eye, maybe I'm a bad devotee, or I'm not going to get anywhere. And I've certainly been through periods like that in my life where it's like, does this stuff really work? I think the thing to remember is you have to look at, am I changing? Am I becoming more saintly the way I must become, the way I must be refined to become Christ-like? And if the answer to that is yes, even if you can't feel a whole lot happening internally, even if you're convinced you're the only person that has never seen the spiritual eye, that's fine. That's perfectly fine. We can't know our karma. I've often thought myself, I wonder how many times, experiencing something deeply in my astral spine has just completely taken me off the spiritual path, that I misread it as something else, or I suddenly decide that I should be a different person or a different thing, and poof, I'm gone. I'm on to something else, or I get proud. And I think I think for most of it, it's probably pretty good that things are kept at a pretty contained level, and that so much of our emphasis is on service, so that there's not that tendency to get trapped in some of the pitfalls of meditation, which are definitely there. But again, there too, we're protected. And I think for all of us, in the kind of balance of service and meditation that we have, that we're protected going through this. It's part of the built-in safety net in this. I think for all of us, the thing to remember, as long as we say, God, I am here because I want thee. I want nothing else but realization. And no matter how confusing this seems, no matter how painful this seems, no matter how it's disquieting, uncomfortable, seemingly impossible how things will work out, that I won't quit. And I will continue to see this as my part of the equation to continue persevering toward perfection. And I know you will help me. I know you will protect me. Whatever's in my past, whatever desire I have had that must be fulfilled, I think must be fulfilled in a certain way, I know you will protect me. So remember, for all of us, that is God's grace to us, that no matter who we are, and we can't know what our spiritual lives will look like. I know this sounds a little odd. Sometimes I'm envious of people who have sort of very simple lives and don't have a lot of responsibility, and maybe have very simple meditations that are very simply devotional. And I can't understand why I'm in all these leadership positions and having to do all this outward stuff. I can feel a little envious for that simplicity. But, I think we can't know why our karma is playing out the way it is. The one thing we can be sure of is God is guiding it. And he knows our every thought. He knows our every action. And just when we think we're not really needing God's help, in fact, we do. Someday we will probably know what we've been saved from. Um, but for now, I think we have to content ourselves with the thought that God is in our lives, moving things, refining our nervous system, working with our karma outwardly, this tremendous Herculean labor. And we may not see hardly any of it, and yet be sure it's happening. And the way you can know that this is happening is look at how you are changing. Are you feeling a little freer inside over the years? Are you feeling more just joy, more freedom in being a devotee and less bound by this world? Those are all signs that you're making good progress. And who knows, maybe we'll have a lifetime where we can spend it enraptured in God, breathless, awake in super consciousness. But for most of us, it's probably not this lifetime. This lifetime is going to be one of intense service and maybe one of a lot of dry meditations, but that is our path to realization. And we have to be willing to offer ourselves as willing participants in this process of growth. It's not like joining a fraternity. I've often think, we're so lucky we don't have a dogmatic spiritual path where people are worried more, did I understand all the details of the teachings, rather than being concerned, are they pure of heart? And for us, it is so much just focused on, you don't even have to pronounce the name of the masters correctly. Rajarsi Janakananda, Master's foremost male disciple, used to mispronounce them. Swami thought it was kind of humorous when he first heard it. Doesn't matter. What matters is the purity of heart. And that's the thing that we work on. That's the thing that will save us.